Question 12. Suppose I have promised to keep a confidence and someone asks me a question that I cannot answer truthfully without thereby breaking the promise. Obviously, I cannot both keep and break the same promise. Therefore, one cannot be obliged both to answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises. So, argument or facts, clearly an argument, structural indicator of therefore, introduces our conclusion that one cannot be obligated both to answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises. And how do we know that? Well, she gives us an example where these two principles are incompatible, where she's promised to keep a confidence and someone asks them a question that she can't answer truthfully without at the same time breaking that promise. So therefore, one cannot be obliged both to answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises. So we see two incompatible principles. First, the duty to keep all promises, and second, the duty to answer all questions truthfully. So now that we have a clear understanding, let's proceed to the question stem. Which one of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning to the argument above? So we notice a parallel reasoning question. And again, you notice what we saw was the author telling us that these two principles were incompatible by showing us a situation where you couldn't comply with both. So let's take a look here at A. It is claimed that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want. It is also claimed that we have the obligation to be civil to others. But civility requires that we not always say what we want. So it cannot be true both that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want and that we have the duty to be civil. So definitely looks like it's on the right track there. What is the conclusion? The conclusion is that it cannot be true both that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want and that we have the duty to be civil. So you notice we have two principles. One, the unencumbered right to say whatever we want, and the duty to be civil. And how do we know that? Well, civility requires that we not always say what we want. And you notice that is the exact same structure of reasoning that we encountered in our passage. So A would be the correct answer. Again, showing us that two things are incompatible, right? By giving us a scenario where you can't comply with both. In the passage, it was this scenario where you had promised to keep a confidence and somebody asked you a question. Well, you can't obviously answer the question truthfully and keep the promise if answering truthfully requires that you break the promise. Whereas below, we have these two duties, the unencumbered right to say whatever and the duty to be civil. But since the duty of civility requires that we not always say what we want, therefore it cannot both be true that we have an unencumbered right to say whatever we want and that we have the duty to be civil. And if you notice, what's happening in A and in the passage is we have sufficient and necessary conditions. In the passage, it tells us that somebody asks a question that I can't answer truthfully without thereby breaking the promise. And again, we know without introduces a necessary condition. So my necessary condition here would be breaking the promise, not keeping a promise. And not only does without introduce a necessary condition, the other part of the statement, negated, is our sufficient condition. So cannot answer truthfully would become answer truthfully. And you notice tell the truth, I would have to break the promise. And you notice the contrapositive, if you keep the promise not to break the confidence, then you can't tell the truth. The idea that telling the truth and keeping the promise can't go together. Not both. They're mutually exclusive in this scenario. In A, you see the same thing. Civility requires, and requires introduces a necessary condition. So our necessary condition would be not always saying what we want. So always saying what we want, not doing that. The other part of the statement would be our sufficient condition, which is civil. The contrapositive, if we always say what we want, then we can't have civility. And again, you notice the exact same idea that civility and always saying what you want can't go together. They're mutually exclusive. So A would be the correct answer. But again, let's make sure here, just quickly checking the other ones. B, some politicians could attain popularity with voters only by making extravagant promises. This, however, would deceive the people. So since the only way for some politicians to be popular is to deceive, and any politician needs to be popular, it follows that some politicians must deceive. Clearly not what we saw in the passage. We don't have two incompatible principles, so B is out. C, if we put a lot of effort into making this report look good, the client might think we did so because we believed our proposal would not stand on its own merits. On the other hand, if we do not try to make the report look good, the client might think we are not as serious about her business. So whatever we do, we risk her criticism. Again, we do not see two incompatible principles, that no matter what, they risk criticism, but not the same form of reasoning that we saw in our passage. D, if creditors have legitimate claims against the business and the business has the resources to pay those debts, then the business is obliged to pay them. Also, if a business has obligations to pay debts, then a court will force it to pay them. But the courts did not force this business to pay its debts, so either the creditors did not have legitimate claims or the business did not have sufficient resources. Again, you notice clearly not the same structure as what we saw in the passage of two incompatible principles. So D is out. And then lastly, checking E, if we extend our business hours, we will either have to hire new employees or have existing employees work overtime, but both new employees and additional overtime would dramatically increase our labor costs. We cannot afford to increase labor costs, so we will have to keep our business hours as they stand. Again, not the same structure as our passage. Again, we are looking for two incompatible principles. So E is out. A, again, had the two incompatible principles that you can't both have the unencumbered right to say whatever and the duty to be civil, because being civil requires that you not always say what you want. So clearly you cannot have both of those things happen at the same time. They're incompatible. And in the passage, we saw this idea of keeping all promises and answering all questions truthfully. But somebody asks me a question that I can't answer truthfully without breaking a promise. So those also would be incompatible.